Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are breaking down the staggering realities of global human mobility, taking a look at a world in motion using some of the latest, most rigorous data from the UNHRC, the International Labour Organization, and the European Union. We hear about migration constantly, right? But the actual numbers tell a story that goes way beyond the daily headlines. So we're going to examine the two primary faces of this movement, those forced to flee their homes and those crossing borders in search of work. To make sense of this massive global issue, here is our roadmap for today. We'll look at the sheer scale of movement, zoom in on refugees in the global south, explore the global migrant workforce, unpack the systemic hurdles they face, and finally, look at the pacts and policies trying to fix it. Let's get started. Section 1, the scale of human movement, a world in motion. And honestly, the sheer numbers here are going to completely challenge what most of us assume about global migration. Before we even look at the data, we really have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. If we want to separate reality from all the political noise out there, who exactly is moving across the globe today and why are they moving? Well, the data splits this into two completely different stories. First, there is this staggering number, 123.2 million. At the end of 2024, that is exactly how many people were forcibly displaced worldwide. Just let that sink in for a second. According to the UNHCR, that is a 6% jump from just the previous year. We're talking about people fleeing conflict, persecution, or severe instability. They literally aren't moving by choice. They're moving just to survive. But running parallel to that crisis is another massive figure, $167.7 million. Based on ILO estimates from 2022, that is the number of international migrant workers actively participating in the global labor force. That is a jump of over 30 million people in less than a decade. These folks are moving primarily for employment and economic opportunity, and honestly, they form a fundamental pillar of our modern global economy. Moving on to Section 2, refugees in the global south, the uneven burden. Let's see how this data actually builds into a narrative about where this forced displacement is truly happening. So, contrary to the narratives that often dominate Western media, low- and middle-income countries, places already grappling with their own severe development challenges, actually host 73% of the world's 42.7 million classified refugees. The burden of sheltering these displaced populations falls overwhelmingly on the global south, not on high-income nations. And you see vast differences in how these host countries handle that incredible pressure. Take Bangladesh, for example. Rohingya individuals aren't even officially recognized as refugees there. They're labeled forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals. The focus is entirely on temporary encampment, no real pathway for social integration. But then you look at Jordan, which offers a really notable example of positive social integration and peaceful coexistence for Syrian refugees. It just goes to show that even under immense strain, different policy choices lead to drastically different human outcomes. All right, Section 3, the global migrant workforce, economics of migration. Shifting gears entirely, let's explore those economic migrants, who now make up an incredible 4.7% of the entire global labor force. Now, the demographics of economic migration look totally different from forced displacement. Unlike refugees in the global south, over 68% of migrant workers are concentrated in high-income countries. In fact, Europe and Central Asia alone host almost 35% of them. We also see a pretty significant gender gap here, with roughly 102.7 million men, compared to about 64.9 million women in this international workforce. And it's absolutely vital to understand that these workers aren't just participating in the economy, they are literally keeping it afloat. They are the absolute backbone of the services sector, stepping up to solve severe global labor shortages. A massive 68.4% of migrant workers are employed in services, dominating care and domestic work. Without this mobile workforce, the high-income economies a lot of us live in would be facing completely paralyzing service deficits. Which brings us to Section 4, systemic hurdles and disparities, the vulnerability gap. Because despite having entirely different motivations for moving, one for survival, one for opportunity, both groups face immense vulnerabilities the second they cross a border. For economic migrants, the disparity is incredibly stark. You'd probably assume that because they move for work, they easily find it, right? Well, actually, migrant workers face a 7.2% unemployment rate globally, compared to just 5.2% for non-migrant workers. So right out of the gate, they are consistently at a disadvantage in the labor market. And the hurdles go way beyond just finding a job.
For refugees, the idea of repatriation, just simply packing up and going home, is often a total myth because of prolonged conflicts. This leaves entire generations of displaced kids in a legal limbo without a clear national identity. From migrant workers, systemic roadblocks like language barriers, unrecognized qualifications, and everyday discrimination hold them back. Plus, there's that severe gender disparity we touched on. Migrant women have an employment-to-population ratio of just 48.1% compared to 73% for men. So whether it's legal limbo or unrecognized skills, these hurdles are deeply baked into the system. And when massive external shocks happen, like a global pandemic, it just decimates job opportunities and completely cuts off aid.
Okay, final section. Pacts, policies, and solutions, managing the flow. With all these massive challenges, how on earth is the global community actually trying to manage this? Well, researchers and policymakers are actually pushing for innovative solutions across a few different fronts. First, we're seeing a push for South-South collaboration, meaning countries like Bangladesh could potentially learn directly from the integration successes of places like Jordan. Second, there's tech innovation. Experts are legitimately proposing using blockchain technology to make sure aid and resources are distributed transparently and effectively in refugee camps. And finally, we are seeing major institutional reform, especially over in Europe. In Europe, where migrant labor is heavily relied upon but asylum applications are fiercely debated, the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum introduced this really fascinating concept called the solidarity cycle. Slated to kick in fully by June 2026, this rule requires the European Commission to assess annually which member states are under the most migratory pressure. It then triggers a solidarity pool to ensure that all member states share the responsibility fairly, rather than just leaving the border nations to deal with the influx entirely on their own. A researcher published in Frontiers beautifully summarized the current academic and humanitarian consensus on all this. They said we must move beyond survival toward lasting well-being for refugees and greater harmony with host communities. In other words, it is no longer just about keeping people alive with temporary band-aids. It's about figuring out sustainable long-term integration. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. The numbers we explored in this explainer, over 123 million displaced folks and nearly 168 million migrant workers, they make one thing crystal clear. Human movement is not a temporary glitch in the system. Whether it's forced by conflict or driven by economics, global mobility is only going to grow. The real question is our global infrastructure actually prepared to treat this as a permanent feature of the future? Thanks so much for joining me today, and I definitely encourage you to keep digging into these crucial global dynamics.